Hi, this is Nicholas Hersh, music director of your Modesto Symphony Orchestra, wanting to invite you here to the Gallo Center for our upcoming concert featuring Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto on April 12th and 13th. This concert features one of the most forward-thinking violin concertos of its era, Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto, featuring some of the most soaring and recognizable themes written for this format of violin and orchestra in the concerto. And yet, Mendelssohn was a composer who was very inspired by the history behind his own music and behind Western classical music in general, and especially when it comes to people like Bach and the Baroque era. So, keeping this in mind, all four pieces on this program are actually focused around looking forward by looking back. The first composer on our program is the Argentinian Astor Piazzolla. As a child, he moved from Argentina to Greenwich Village, Manhattan, where he encountered for the very first time in a pawn shop a bandoneon, which is a type of accordion that was very popular in Argentina. His dad bought it for him, and suddenly he was playing Bach on the bandoneon. And this love of both Bach and bandoneon-style music would stay with him throughout his life, when he would go to Europe to study with classical luminaries like Nadia Boulanger. And then on a return to Argentina, he would take everything that he knew of the classical form and translate that back into popular music like the tango, for which he became very, very widely known, especially in Argentina, but certainly around the world as well. This dual love of the popular tango and serious classical composition really represents his style in a nutshell. And the piece we have of his is called Tangazo, or the Big Tango. It starts with this very Bach-like opening, which involves a fugue for the strings. Very much untango, there's no rhythm yet at all, but it starts with this low theme for the low strings that gets passed around in this very contrapuntal Baroque style until slowly it transforms into this wonderful tango that features traditional tango techniques that usually aren't played by our typical orchestral style. These are things like playing behind the bridge as a string player and creating little whips and snaps, percussive effects from instruments that aren't percussion instruments. It's a phenomenal piece. It's one of my all-time favorites of the 20th century. The second composer on our program is Louise Farrenc, French composer from the 19th century, who was one of the first women to be appointed to the faculty of the very prestigious Paris Conservatory. Now, she would work steadily and gain a reputation for being not only a fabulous composer but a fabulous teacher as well, but for years was paid substantially less than her male counterparts, until she premiered one of her masterpieces, her Nonette. That's chamber music for 9 people. That was so extraordinary, she campaigned and finally earned to be paid at the same level as her male colleagues, marking a true historical victory for women composers in the period. Her style is very unique in that she refuses the more bombastic romantic style that was popularized by folks like Hector Berlioz in his Symphonie Fantastique. And rather, she wanted to look more closely at early Romantic and even classical and Baroque style as her influence. And she did this in such a way that she honored these old styles, but also carried them forward to a place where they would not have come otherwise. She had a beautiful ear for melody, for orchestration, and her Symphony No. 3, which is the one we're featuring on our program, is this wonderful G minor, very dark, very serious composition that marks her style at her most mature, at her most creative, and yes, at her most understanding of those composers that came before her. It's a real rarity to hear these days, and I'm very, very excited to be able to present this wonderful symphony by an immensely talented composer for our audiences here in Modesto. So on a program that has a lot to do with Bach, it's inevitable, I guess, that we should actually play a little Bach as well. We have one of Bach's most famous fugues, the Little G minor fugue. And a fugue is a very tricky thing to define. It has a typical classical definition, of course, but it's one of those things that you just know it's a fugue when you hear it. When you hear a melody that's played by one instrument and then played by a different instrument while that first instrument is now playing something entirely different and yet somehow related. It's just one of those things, oh yeah, that sounds like a fugue. And Bach, of course, quite literally wrote the book on fugue. You may instantly recognize the main theme of this fugue, originally written for keyboard or most likely organ. In this case, I've actually arranged it for a very small orchestra that wants to preserve the intimate qualities of it being originally a solo piece for one player to perform simultaneously all these different interweaving contrapuntal lines, but with the involvement of winds and strings and brass and even a little percussion, you can add all sorts of wonderful colors to each iteration, each repeat of this main fugal melody. So it's a lot of fun. It's almost like putting together a puzzle when you are arranging something like this, when you have these beautiful sequences of music that you're just essentially deciding, it would sound really interesting played by these two instruments together, or maybe this instrument solo. So it's a really, really enjoyable and fun idea for me to be able to take this original Bach composition and translate it to a more modern style of orchestra. Finally, on our program, we feature one of the greatest works for violin and orchestra ever, by Felix Mendelssohn, his Violin Concerto in E minor. Mendelssohn was certainly a prodigy when he burst onto the scene. He started writing some of his most famous and most impressive music when he was just a teenager. He was an immensely virtuosically capable violinist himself, and most of his early works are written for string instruments, so he's really a master of everything stringed, everything that involves the violin and viola and cello and bass in some format. And yet later in life, he moved away from composing and started actually conducting and programming older pieces of music, which is really the first appearance of a musician identifying themselves as a conductor of an orchestra, in the modern sense anyway. Mendelssohn was a huge admirer of Bach and programmed many pieces by Bach that we would not know of now were it not for him. But in his post as conductor of the orchestra in Leipzig, Germany, he found a violinist whom he decided, I'm going to write this newfangled composition for, a violin concerto, in a new style where it's not three distinct movements as it was for many, many years in this genre, but actually something a little bit more modern, and yet again incorporating some of those old Baroque techniques like counterpoint and fugal writing as well. Apparently it took him years to come to terms with the very first thing you hear in the violin, this haunting theme played by the violin solo over this textural bed of rustling strings. He said it haunted him for years, this theme, and I think you'll hear it may haunt you as well as you listen to it. We are so lucky to be able to feature a wonderful soloist, Ty Murray, as our guest artist for this concert. She comes with an amazingly impressive resume. I'm so excited to be able to work with her on this really, really phenomenal and brilliant piece of music. So please join me April 12th and 13th right here at the Gallo Center for Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto featuring Ty Murray and your Modesto Symphony Orchestra.